Hi, my name is Spencer. I have been at Tableau for the past 6 years, and I have recently decided to move on to a startup, and that made me do a lot of reflection on my tenure there. And I found that a lot of things actually revolved around productivity, and I identified three principles that, through my observations, made people really productive. I wanted to share that in case it's helpful to anyone else, and I hope it is. These are opinions. You may have different opinions. There's lots of ways to be productive. It's completely fine if you disagree. These are my own thoughts and observations on what I have seen make teams and individuals successfully in a productivity sense. I have organized them into three categories that I'll dive into. And just so you know, I have two dogs, and they will periodically probably appear behind my camera. And with that said, let's get started with some context about who I am. So, like I said, my name is Spencer. I started a startup in 2011. I was in high school. Then I went to the University of Texas, then Tableau after graduating. While at Tableau, I was a university instructor at the University of Washington. And next week, actually, I will be a software engineer over at Astronomer IO, which I'm really excited about. So that's just to give some context on where my observations are coming from. So next, I'd like to talk about the three principles. So the three principles are always be value driven, meaning always have a clear goal and intent for everything that you do. Always be progressing, so make sure you're moving in the right direction, and always be people first. People are at the center of everything, and it's really important to keep that in mind. So for each of these principles, I'm going to break down more about what it is. I have some sub-tenets for each of them to give more detail about how how to follow this, and I'm going to give some examples. And at the end of each principle, I will provide an audit check, which is just a list of questions to sort of check against yourself, see if you really are following this productivity principle. So let's get started with value. So always be value driven. So the four tenets of being value driven are goals, customer centric, minimize process, and time management. So let's start with goals. It's really important that you always have a clear goal and intent for everything that you do. This is for big things like deciding what feature you're going to write and in what order you're going to choose which features, to even small things like, are you going to a meeting? Every decision you make should be centered around some goal. There should be a clear reason why you're doing that. It doesn't have to be super precise. It can be vague, but it has to exist. There has to be some driving force, or else it's really easy to be somewhat aimless and not really get things done. For example, I found meetings without goals tend to be circular. People talk without really having a goal in mind. It doesn't really go anywhere, and it just wastes time. So the next tenet I'm going to talk about is customer centric. So everything that you do ultimately should be for the customer. You should be able to draw a line back to every decision that you make, everything that you are doing. You should be able to draw that back to the customer. If you can't draw a line very clearly back to how this is delivering value to the customer, something is probably wrong. Now, just to quickly define like what I mean by customer, usually it's end customer, so the people who are consuming the software that you write. However, it could also mean a mentee of yours or other developers who are using some cool tool that you're writing. Right? There's lots of different types of customers, and it's important that you are gearing towards some specific customer. So next is minimizing process. So process and overhead are costs. We want to minimize that as much as possible. Every decision creates what's called decision fatigue. There's only so many decisions that you can make in a day before your brain starts to fatigue and kind of give up. So it's important to minimize that. Additionally, every meeting burns time, every PowerPoint costs more time, every process adds another layer of abstraction between you and your goal. Really, if you can avoid a process, please do so. It makes things, the density of value per time, much less. And we'll talk about time next. Um, there are very obvious ones, like if you don't need a meeting, don't go to the meeting. But there's also smaller things that people might not think about. For example, if you're using Slack and you @channel, if you @channel, that messages everyone in the channel that you had something to say. That will bring up a notification for all of those people. Even if that message only takes 1 to 2 seconds to read, that's not how much time you've actually cost everyone. Instead, they have to context switch out of what they're doing, read that message, decide if they should respond, and then context switch back into whatever they were doing. So this will break flow if they're in a state of flow, and it costs about 30 minutes is what I've read on different studies. So it's actually a pretty big penalty, even though it doesn't feel like it. That said, not all process is bad. Anarchy is pretty bad. You don't want anarchy. As an example of a process that adds value at Tableau is we have security reviews. Every feature we write goes through a security review process. We do it early on in the feature, and it's required for every feature. I think that's really valuable. The security team has lots of great insights and have caught many would-be security bugs that would be quite costly. I think that that process is a good one that should be kept. Lastly, I'm going to talk about time management. It's really important to respect time, both for yourself and for others. Time is the only resource that you can never regenerate in your life. Both in my personal life and in my work life, time is the most valuable thing to me. It's just so finite. It's okay to say something is not worth the time investment to do. That could be something as simple as attending a meeting, but it could also be fixing a bug, choosing to write a feature. There's lots of different places that you can spend your time, and you only have so much of it to spend. Be very careful with how you spend it. Try to maximize your value that you're able to produce. So when deciding which things to do, I usually take into consideration what is my expected value that I'm going to generate from this thing, assuming it succeeds. What is the risk that it does not succeed? And what is the cost, the amount of time and resources that it takes to do it? Between those three things, I can usually balance where I want to spend my time. So that is our first principle. Let's move on to a more specific example of this first value-driven principle. So something I've seen a lot at many companies is an issue about ownership. So people will end up fighting over who owns something. Is that my bug or my feature, or is it theirs? There can be bug ping pong where everybody's just throwing the bug around. And all of this wastes time, adds confusion, induces stress, and leads to a bad customer experience. The discussion over ownership in this way does not actually add any value. It's just adding overhead. It commonly causes people to lose focus on what matters. Really what matters is what is that value you're driving for the customer, and thinking about things like this usually isn't it. This should be just a natural thing. I found that the underlying source of a lot of this is that people tend to think about a little island that they live on. They want to perfect their team's island, and they make that a little paradise. But that's not what the customer gets. They don't get an island, they get the world. You have to be very considerate to what is the world getting. So with that said, there are different values between yourself, your team, and your company, and you do have to balance all three of those. And when you introduce new teams and new relationships, I found it can be helpful to decide your core values and tenets ahead of time. Just have a quick discussion or write it down, and that can help with things like this. So some questions to ask that are good for ownership is this good for the customer, right? Does this give value to that customer that you're trying to serve? Do you have the relevant expertise? If you don't, can you get support? That's it. That's all I could think of for relevant questions. Is it good? And can you do it? That's it. Questions that I found are distracting and aren't helpful to ask are, does my team own this? Who owns this? If we work on this, what is that signal for future ownership? If we touch this, are we on the line in the future? Who gets credit for this? How will this affect our sprint velocity? There's endless questions of this nature. They don't benefit the customer. They're just overhead, and they distract from the true value of delivering to the customer. The customer does not care who owns what. So let's move on to the audit. So these are just two questions that you can ask yourself to see, are you following this principle of being value-driven? So the first is, what was your decision route? Why did you make a decision? Can you trace it back to the customer? That should be relatively straightforward. If it's not, something's probably wrong. The other is, what is your area under the curve? So this is a philosophy that I've thought about and tried to live by for a long time now. And I recently was talking to a few people from Neuralink and found that they also follow the same principle. And they defined it as this equation, impact equals breadth times meaningfulness, which I really like. That means how much impact you make is how many people you affect and how deeply you impact them. So I really like that. If you're not familiar with Neuralink, they are developing an ultra-high bandwidth brain interface to communicate between humans and computers. And the possibilities and the applications of that are quite limitless. So, for example, they might have to decide, do we want to focus on curing paralysis based on spine injuries? Or do we want to allow telepathy between people? Two very different things. There's many, many very different possible avenues that they could pursue like that. The way that they make their decisions, at least what they told me, is each decision is framed under this equation. What maximizes the area under the curve? What has the most impact? Breadth times meaningfulness. How many people are you affecting, and does it actually matter? So that is the first principle, value-driven, always be value-driven. The next one is always be progressing. So I'm going to start this with a quote from my fitness instructor that I really like. Even the biggest mountain requires a first step. I just like that quote. So there's 3 tenets within progressing. Vague is okay. Long-term and explore. So I'm going to dive into each of those. So the vague, it's okay to not have a very concise goal at the beginning. We talked about that a little bit in an earlier slide. It's important that you move in the right direction, but it doesn't have to be that specific at the beginning. So as an example, if you want to go from America to China, you don't have to be very specific to start your journey. You have to decide, am I going east or west? And that's pretty much it for a long time. Then as you approach China, you might have to decide, am I going to the southern half? Am I going to the eastern parts? Where within what area of China am I trying to reach? As you get closer to that, you have to pick a port. So every level that you get closer to that goal, you have to be more specific, but you can progress even with a vague goal at the beginning of go to China. So I'm going to move on to the long-term tenet. So something that happens a lot is people consciously choose to do the short-term thing instead of the long-term thing. Quick fix that they plan to replace later. And on paper, it sounds reasonable. Sometimes that makes sense, and you would think quick fix plus that long-term fix, not that much, so let's just do it that way. However, there's a lot of hidden costs to doing a quick fix, particularly if it lasts a long time. I found that the longer it sits, the more assumptions and dependencies are built around it. and it gets tangled up in the code base and eventually becomes extremely hard to remove. And taking away all of those dependencies and assumptions ends up being more expensive sometimes than the long-term solution would have just been. So I think it's really important that you are not wasting time with things like quick fixes. Try and plan for the long term. Somewhat related, something that actually my chemistry teacher back in high school taught me was it's harder to unlearn something than to learn something. And I think this is similar to that. Now, that said, planning for the long term is great. However, waterfall sucks. You don't want to do a waterfall methodology, at least typically. You can't test your hypothesis. You don't see value return for a really long time. Your goals are more and more disjoint and disconnected from the real purpose. You can't test it. It's just not a great way to develop for most things, in my opinion. I think it's important to deliver value along the way to remedy that. So you plan for the long term, you have that long-term goal, but along the way you have clear deliverables that will provide benefits to the customers. And by doing so, you can learn more about this area that you're building in and how the customers receive it. I think that that's a much better way to go about it. As an example to that I think I did quite poorly a few years ago is Tableau had performance issues, and so I decided to investigate. I found there was a big infrastructure issue where really everything was built on synchronicity. Nothing was asynchronous. So I wanted to create a platform for Tableau where you could allow tasks to be asynchronous and run in the background, which made a lot of sense. It would have been a big performance improvement, and I still think that was a good idea. Where I think I went wrong was I thought that this was, because it was so impactful and because it was such a big deal, I wanted to get it exactly right. I wanted to deliver the perfect feature. And because of that, I tried to research every piece of the code that I could. There's like 100 million lines of code or something at Tableau. I tried to find every hidden synchronicity-based bug that I could prior to even writing code. I found every stakeholder that seemed relevant around the company, and I involved them in regular discussions and talked about a very detailed plan on how this was going to work, received feedback, iterated, talked to them again, and had that feedback loop over and over. I don't think that was a good way to develop that feature. In retrospect, I would have done it very differently. If I could redo this, I would start by first do some research. It's good to have that base of knowledge, but start experimenting early on. I would have built a prototype. I would have tried seeing, hey, does this work or that work? And does this interface even feel right? And let's expose some bugs that we can't really predict. Let's see the unknown unknowns. There's a lot of discoverability that you can't really hit until you start doing that development. And so I think it's important to do that as early on as you can, even if it's a prototype that you're just kind of experimenting with. Additionally, I think all those stakeholders I mentioned I involved, I went too detailed with. This is a problem I see some people doing when they're trying to make the perfect feature like I was. They come up with a very detailed plan, which takes a lot of time for both you and the people that you are involving. And then almost inevitably, something's going to deviate from that plan if it has a high level of detail. The higher level of detail, the more likely it's going to have to deviate. Once you have to deviate, you probably want to revisit with all those people, discuss, make sure everyone's in agreement that there's this new path to take, and that takes more and more and more time. So I found there's a good balance on that. You don't want to get too detailed like that. You don't want to be too high level where you're not discussing anything valuable either. But it is important to discuss where you have flexibility in how you achieve that. They should be somewhat higher level goals that allow you to experiment as you do that long-term progressing mentality. And lastly is explore. So kind of like what we just talked about, but with explore, that's really as you go, you're going to continue learning, and there are new opportunities that will unveil themselves. It's important to be willing to realize those opportunities as they come up. It's if you deliver the exact thing that you set out to build, it means you probably weren't exploring enough. There were some innovation along that path that you probably ignored. So it's really important that you explore. There's a lot of great value that you oftentimes you can see that is adjacent. That said, you can go extreme with that. We call that feature creep. Don't explore too much. Don't get distracted from your true goal. Don't continue bringing in a bunch of other features. Make sure that it is the right decision to make, that if you are deviating, that there is a really good reason for that. So just really be willing to reevaluate. And something to keep in mind as you explore, failure is only a failure if you don't learn from it. I think a failure typically is as a success because that's where I learn the most. So let's go through another audit. So the always be progressing audit. There's lots of questions for this one. So first, a lot of these are pretty straightforward. It's like, what is the project state now versus yesterday? What is your end goal now versus last week or last month, last year? That's a good way to test, are you exploring enough? How would you have done it a year ago? That's a way to test, are you progressing yourself? Are you developing yourself to be better? It's hard to tell day by day that you're improving, even though you are. Just like how you can't tell that your hair grows day by day. But over time it accumulates and your hair grows long, just like you develop quite a lot. By comparing yourself to a large time slice ago, like a year ago, that's an easier way that I've found to see how much progress you've actually made. So another is how much has been added, which is similar to explore. How much has changed, another kind of explore area. How does the ideal state compare to the current state? How does this get you closer to the end goal? And how often do customers receive value? So an example of that last one that we talked about with like waterfall isn't super great. I think it's really interesting how different companies have gone about developing a self-driving car. I think Tesla has developed a very iterative approach, whereas Google's Waymo has developed a very waterfall approach. I personally think that that iterative approach is going to allow Tesla to innovate much more quickly and will make them succeed, whereas the Waymo is going to be harder. For example, Tesla has continually released updates as they improve this autopilot, which delivers value to customers. First, it's something simple like just staying in the lane, which is valuable, and it's a first step. Then it's being able to lane change and then overtake a slow car, then getting off an exit, and now they're adding residential streets. So they are slowly adding what it's capable of doing, and that's delivering value for the customers along the way, which is this is an extremely long-term project, and it would suck if we had to wait all these many, many years to see what comes to fruition. And as they've been testing, they've had all kinds of data and learning from that, and they've ended up rewriting autopilot pretty much from scratch, I believe, like 3 times now, because they have learned how to approach it in very different ways that they didn't expect. There's all kinds of unknown unknowns that have appeared, and they couldn't have known those unknown unknowns unless they actually started testing it. On the other side, Waymo, at least my understanding, is Google doesn't want to release Waymo to the public until it can fully self-drive, like no steering wheel. And I think that's going to be extremely hard to achieve without having data in the interim. So that is progressing, always be progressing. The third and final principle is always be people first. So this is something I don't think I particularly did well at the beginning of my career. I thought, I'm a software engineer, I'm going to write software, that's my job, I'm going to stay in that little bubble. However, that disconnects you from a large population of people that could help you grow, that you could help grow. There's connections to things like the PM who really understands the feature work and how that affects customers. It's really important to have a broad network of people, and expanding that network increases your odds of being successful pretty dramatically. So I split this up into three tenets: happy, mirrors, and sponges, which is all kind of a little weird, but we'll dive into that. So the first one, happy. I found happy people are the most productive people. Unless you can make somebody happy, they won't be productive. It's a requirement. To make people happy, the most common thing I've seen is aligning their personal core values with the work that they're doing. So what they do should not only help the customer, but help themselves. They should be motivated for whatever reason it is, whether it's improving a skill set or they just like delivering to lots of people, whatever it is, make sure that it aligns so that they have motivation to deliver. And that includes yourself. Don't take on work where you're not going to be happy because you won't be productive doing it. It has to be both good for the customer and yourself. Also, another way to keep people happy, I found, is just provide support when needed, and always do that. Try and help as many people as you can. If you help an army is willing to help you too. And something to keep in mind as you do this, it takes a long time to build a bridge, but it takes very little time to burn a bridge. And the last point, if you're right and no one likes you, it doesn't matter. No one cares. Nobody's going to listen. You're not going to be able to get it done unless people like you. So the next tenet, mirrors. So people are mirrors, kind of like kindergarten saying, what you say or what you do reflects back onto you. If you're quick to help people, you'll be quick to get help. If you're not willing to help, people probably won't help you. It's important that you project and help other people as best you can so that when you need help, they will return the favor. And lastly, sponges. So that is to say, everyone absorbs what you put out there to some extent. Some people are more spongy than others, but it all happens to some extent. If you're happy, it rubs off on other people. If you're excited, it's going to incite excitement. If you're lethargic, it drags people down. So it's really important to be mindful of how people are interpreting what you're exuding, your attitude, so to speak. And it's also important to keep in mind that is interpretation, not necessarily reality. Even if you're really happy, but you look sad, that's going to bring people down. It's important how they interpret it. What's the perception? For me personally, I think a lot of people did not perceive, I have a hard time emoting. So a lot of people weren't able to really understand when I was happy or sad. And so I've done a lot of work to make sure that people are able to see those emotions now. So let's do an audit on this. So people first, I broke up into two different audits. The first one for the individual contributor and the second one for managers. So for the individual contributor, you could ask yourself, would your coworkers want to have a beer with you? Do they like you? What is important to person X outside of work? So if you don't know what's important to them outside of work, you don't really have a good social relationship. And it's very hard to detach people into just a work person. It's important to have that holistic understanding of them. When you talk, do people listen? So if they're not listening, there's probably a reason for that. And it's a hard truth, but it is. If someone needs help, would they ask you? Do you listen to other people? A good way to test that is based on what someone says, does that change what you're going to do? If it doesn't, you're not listening, and people know that. And are people afraid to give you criticism? So like I mentioned, this one was really important to me because like I mentioned, people had a hard time interpreting a lot of my emotions. And so they were afraid to give me criticism because they didn't know how I would react. And so I put in a lot of effort to making it very clear that I very much appreciate constructive criticism. and I value it very deeply. And the higher volume of criticism I get, the faster I grow. That's been probably the most connected to growth is how much criticism am able to get. So I put in a lot of work to make sure people knew that I am fine with criticism, and then I got more criticism, and that allowed me to grow much faster. So the next one is for managers. It's not necessarily just for managers, it's any mentor-mentee type relationship. These are questions that I ask for each of my mentees. They're really important to me. So I ask, what are the individual's core values? How does the individual's work map to these values? And what does the individual want to grow into? Where are they trying to go? So all of these should be really easy and natural to answer. If they're not, there's something wrong with that relationship. Additionally, a good way to sort of test this, and something I actually do with my interns and some of my mentees when I'm helping assign projects and things like that, is I'll make a bipartite graph dividing the person's core values and the work and making sure everything maps together. So whatever you're doing should make that bipartite graph. There should be no floating nodes. So those are the 3 principles. Always be value-driven, always be progressing, and always be people first. It's really important to have a clear goal that you're always moving towards and that you bring people along with you. So I wanted to share my learnings. I hope it's applicable to you and that it's helpful. And yeah, that is it from me. So thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.